Good morning to each of you across the African continent and to those joining us on the length and breadth of Canada. I'm Gareth Blaw, President of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome each of you today to this webinar tackling one of the most important subjects of net zero emissions and the critical role of business in this pursuit. Your Excellencies, High Commissioners, Ambassadors, Director General Tariq Khan, Global Affairs Canada for the Africa region, past president of the Chamber, board members, directors, and of course, members and friends of the Chamber. It is my great pleasure to provide these opening remarks for today's session. A number of you are watching this through the recorded version, giving some conflicting aspects to your schedule. Please be assured that the link below provides details for you to get in touch directly with myself or any of our speakers today. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to turn to the nation's capital of Ottawa and welcome Vice President of the Chamber, Susan Namolindwa, for an official opening before we turn to the ministerial level remarks for our session today. Susan, very good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Gareth, and good morning across Canada, and good afternoon, good evening across the beautiful continent. It is a pleasure for me to welcome everyone to this important session about our carbon zero future. I was speaking to a friend of mine this week who lives in Australia, and she said it seemed as though there was an invisible line across the country. One half is experiencing severe flooding, hundreds of homes are buried in water, and the other half has severe drought. I started there and then I wanted to bring it a little bit closer to home. Over here in Canada, last year in BC, we had extreme heat, record-breaking temperatures. We had fires and water flooding, washing out bridges and highways, which recovery is still ongoing and it's going to be for a while. I want to bring it right here home in Ottawa. Just last January, this January, we experienced a record-breaking, I think it was 100 years record-breaking snowfall. I am not a news reporter this morning, and neither am I intending to bring all kinds of history, but I'm highlighting these just to indicate that these are only symptoms of a bigger problem that we have. Now, we are not lacking for science or history, facts that have been put together about the effects of climate change and emissions and all that stuff. So this conversation today is not about band-aid solutions, because we've passed that time. We've passed the time of corporations planting 1,000 trees somewhere and going back to emissions or business as usual. We've passed that. We've passed the time of summits and webinars and research and policy reports and recommendations that are done and then they sit on the shelves. We are past that. This problem requires immediate action. And as happens with most problems, on the flip side is an opportunity. This is no different. This problem is an opportunity for Canada to demonstrate leadership with our Canadian companies, with innovations that bring others to the table, partnerships and collaborations across the world. And in this case, because I'm talking about Africa, collaborations with African companies and African governments, with the help and the support of the Canadian government to really tackle this challenge. And so I'm excited about this conversation today, and we have an extremely capable and incredible lineup. So I'm going to hand it over back to you, Gareth, so that you can introduce our speakers for this exciting conversation we have today. Thank you.
Well, Susan, thank you very much. And I certainly look forward to seeing you and many others in Ottawa next week as part of some of the engagements the Chamber is having there. And no doubt this has been an anchor topic among the industry sectors, but also the themes that the Chamber has been tackling together with Global Affairs Canada, who are supporting this event. So thank you to Global Affairs and the partnership that they've had, not only in this program, but in several programs to date. Many of you heard from Minister Mary Ng just earlier this month here at the Chamber in tackling critical issues around how private sector solutions come to the fore. And I'm very pleased to be welcoming two key individuals in that conversation in just a moment. But to set the context for the discussion among private sector players, particularly in collaboration with the Trade Commissioner Service, I'm very pleased to welcome remarks from the Parliamentary Secretary to Minister Mary Ng, MP Virani. Unfortunately, MP Virani is not with us in person, but in conversation a little earlier, we were able to go through a few key items, and he has the following message that he'd like to share. And it's a message in the context not only of Minister Ng's specific Africa mandate around free trade, but also in how trade and development is enabled inherently through best business practice that reaches that 2050 net zero emission target. It's my great pleasure to share the remarks of MP Virani, live, recorded earlier, live from Ottawa.
Hello everyone, bonjour à tous. Thanks Gareth for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business for making this event happen. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person today to meet all of the African and Canadian business leaders gathering together to cement ties between our two regions. Canada understands the importance of addressing climate change, and we're ready to innovate, diversify, and partner with leaders across the continent of Africa. In fact, when Minister Ng went to the African continent in 2020, she highlighted Canada's commitment to working with Africans to address common priorities, including climate change. With thousands of specialized firms in clean technologies and renewables, Canadians believe that we can help fight climate change and bring increased stability and prosperity, both at home and abroad. That is why last March we hosted the first Canada-Africa Clean Growth Symposium to discuss topics ranging from low-carbon economies and clean technologies to green mining and climate-resilient solutions. The Canada-Africa Clean Growth Symposium is an example of our commitment to continue building a more inclusive, innovative, and sustainable future as we transition to a clean growth economy and aim for net zero emissions by 2050. In fact, on the margins of that symposium, Canada and the African Development Bank announced the creation of a $132 million Canada-African Development Bank Climate Fund to catalyze public and private sector investments in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And just 2 weeks ago, Minister Ng and her counterparts from South Africa, Senegal, Botswana, and Cote d'Ivoire launched a virtual trade mission for women-owned and led businesses in the renewable energy and the information and communications technology information sectors, seeking stronger ties and increased trade throughout the continent. As a Ugandan-born Canadian myself who has had the opportunity to work and live in East Africa during my time with the UN, I know personally about the continent and the great potential that is within Africa. Canada is an important trading and investment partner for the many dynamic economies in Africa. And with our shared priorities of creating more good jobs and finding sustainable solutions for economic growth, we look forward to growing our relationship even further. As a Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade, I know that Canadian businesses are always looking for opportunities to expand into new export markets. Canadian businesses are ready and able to deliver clean growth solutions throughout the continent of Africa. But don't take my word for it. Here are some of the facts. The Government of Canada has committed more than $2.3 billion to support Canadian clean tech firms growing and reaching new export markets. We mean business. And at COP26, we announced a doubling of Canada's international climate finance commitment from $2.65 billion to $5.3 billion over the next 5 years. We've prioritized clean growth as a central part of our inclusive and diversified international trade. It's a key part of Canada's plan to build back better post the COVID-19 pandemic. Together we can create a more sustainable future, and the future starts now with all of you participating in this event. Your innovation and collaboration will lead the way in our pursuit of a more sustainable future and will set our nations up for a strong recovery. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
A massive thank you there to the Honourable Member of Parliament for those remarks just provided a little earlier this morning, and very consistent again for many of you who were at the event, the 3-day summit where the Prime Minister himself provided remarks on the context by which we do business and we deepen Canada's relationship on the African continent through accelerating trade and investment, and of course, achieving the vital social and environmental objectives that go with responsible global citizenship. Well, two speakers, and starting with one key company, is about to address just how that is done. And it's my great pleasure to acknowledge the two speakers that are joining us now, before which we move and proceed into a Q&A session. I'd like to call upon Robert Niven to turn on his camera. Robert, an incredible schedule that you have. I don't know how you make the time, but we're deeply grateful. I first read about you actually in the media several months ago. I believe it was The Star, and subsequently saw a lot more around the work that you're doing, taking the cement industry, and really an area of importance. In Africa, we see massive growth. Concrete is huge. The wealthiest person on the continent, in fact, made his money through concrete. And you're saying there's a relationship there. There's an issue that has an environmental cost, and you're changing that and transforming it. So just in terms of a bit of background on yourself, for those who don't know, Robert Niven is the Chair and Chief Executive Officer of CarbonCure Technologies. It's the current global leader in carbon dioxide removal technology for the concrete industry. This company was founded by Rob back in 2012 with a simple goal of making concrete sustainable and profitable for the industry. And with Rob at the helm, this is a company that's achieving a mission to reduce 500 million tons of CO2 emissions annually by the year 2030, helping well on the way to the 2050 target for net zero that's been set by governments and pronounced upon by the government of Canada, as we just heard earlier. Robert, I know you've won multiple awards. You're on several lists for top business, but you're very much a Canadian sharing this technology in this capacity globally. And I believe it began with your expansion just south into the United States. It's my great honor to welcome you on behalf of all of us here today to the floor for your 15-minute presentation on how you're helping ensure we meet the net zero 2050 ambitions. Robert.
Thank you very much for having me today, Gareth. It's a distinct pleasure. And I was looking back at some of the history of this company as well. And it's in many ways it actually began in Africa. And I was attending the UN climate meetings in Nairobi several years ago. And that was just after attending university where I researched this topic. And it was certainly an important catalyst for me to really understand the full potential of how technology can really solve big societal issues, notably climate change. So I had very good memories of that conference and the relationships that I had developed at that time, and have subsequently done quite a bit of return visits to the continent. It's also where the future growth of CarbonCure and most of the world's infrastructure will be occurring. And if we are to meet our net zero targets with the topic of today's session, it's critical that we don't continue to develop infrastructure in the same way that we've done in the past. We have to develop it at the same cost and quality, but we have to be able to decarbonize all of that infrastructure, which is largely made out of concrete. So today I'd like to share a few points about that. I was going to start off with a very short video by one of, as you had mentioned, Mr. Dangote's closest friends, who has made a video and some remarks about CarbonCure. So let me just kick that off and share my screen. Here we are. You'll probably recognize the voice.
The world is expected to add more than 2 trillion square feet of new building space by 2060. That's the equivalent of adding another New York City every month for the next 40 years. Many of these buildings will be made using cement, a massive emitter of greenhouse gases. But a company in Canada discovered an innovative way to reduce cement's carbon footprint.
The effects of climate change are going to happen. We're seeing it every day, but this is a solvable problem. Our industry can decarbonize. Cement is the glue. It's the active ingredient in making concrete. It is the product that we build modern society with.
People often ask, what is the difference between cement and concrete? And cement is really the chemistry behind concrete. A simple analogy would be if you're baking a cake, the flour would be the cement and the cake would be the concrete, the finished product.
To to make concrete. You dig up limestone from the ground, and then you run that through a kiln. Each pound of limestone that you put into this kiln, 1/2 goes up into the atmosphere as CO2. CarbonCure is a technology company helping concrete producers transition into the new low-carbon economy.
I'm just going to stop it right there. There's another couple minutes because I had prepared some slides as well. But I thought that was a great way to start the discussion to really understand the global opportunity here. And they talk about all of those New York cities that will be built every 30 days. Well, many of those New York cities will be occurring in the African continent, where in the past decade or 2 decades, that development has largely occurred in China. But a lot of that development is now shifting. And it's particularly important for this topic going forward. So I've prepared a few slides. Let me just walk through some of these to provide a bit more context. Just bear with me for 1 minute, please.
We developed a technology.
Excuse me. Go. Try that again. There we go. Okay. So today we're going to talk about concrete and how it is a decarbonization challenge. And by using carbon removal technologies such as CarbonCure, we're able to decarbonize infrastructure and development without having to compromise cost or quality. Whenever you hear the words net zero, you should really be thinking the words carbon removal technologies. There is no way to be able to meet net zero targets without having carbon removal. So what do I mean by that? Net zero means that by, let's say, 2050, when many of these goals are being made, is there will continue to be some residual emissions. That's why the net is important, because we need these negative emission technologies, which are also called carbon removal, to be able to make up and then surpass the amount of residual greenhouse gas emissions which will be occurring, so that we're able to make that net zero component. And CarbonCure is a global leader in this space of carbon removal technologies, which will allow countries or companies to be able to meet their net zero targets. So that's really what we're talking about today. That carbon removal and net zero linkage is critically important. The really interesting thing about concrete is it has unparalleled scale. Just look at this graph. You can see how much more concrete is produced than all of the other commodities combined. And as we look to the African continent, and I believe that this is a roadway in Nairobi, there is going to be an incredible amount of concrete that's being poured now and into the future to be able to develop all of this infrastructure to support all the economic and population growth. We can't continue to do it the same way as we have in the past. And that's where CarbonCure comes in. We're a Canadian company based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that's the world leader in carbon removal technologies. And we work in the concrete industry. We're able to take the challenge and scale of concrete and combine that with the power of technology to be able to turn this enormous industry into a climate solution, which is a paradigm shift where oftentimes concrete and cement are considered a large and problem as in terms of climate change, where it accounts for about 7% of worldwide greenhouse gases and is the largest industrial source of greenhouse gas emissions. You had mentioned a couple of awards that we've won in the past. One of our most notable ones was winning the Carbon X Prize, which is a global 5-year competition to choose the most scalable carbon removal technology on the planet, our carbon utilization technology. There's a subsequent X Prize that's just been launched by Elon Musk from Tesla that we're also pursuing to win that prize as well, which is a $100 million prize. So prizes are great to have the recognition. Our investors include, our largest investor is Bill Gates through Breakthrough Energy Ventures, but also some other very notable names like Amazon, Microsoft, Mitsubishi, many prop tech funds, and Canadian venture firms such as BDC. So what is it that we do? We retrofit concrete plants. Very plainly, we do not make concrete, nor will we ever make concrete. What we do is we work with local concrete producers. we retrofit their plants with our technology that allows them nearly immediately to begin consuming CO2 rather than releasing it. So they take that CO2 and they run it through this process, which creates a chemical reaction, which turns that CO2 into a stone. So we're actually converting that greenhouse gas into a stone and concrete, a very, very fine material, which actually improves the strength of the concrete, which then provides cost-saving opportunities. So it's both a cost efficiency opportunity as well as a CO2 opportunity. We're operating around the world already, which includes just about all 6 continents. We have some very exciting announcements to be made very shortly about our first plants in Africa, which we're awfully excited to get started on, working with some local companies in the West African region. So to date, there's about 550 plants or customers that we've signed in over 20 countries that have produced about 17 million cubic yards of concrete overall. That's created a significant amount of CO2 savings, about 144,000 metric tons, which is equivalent to about planting 173,000 acres of forest land, would be the impact that our company has had within the concrete industry. And we're just getting started. So like I said, easy retrofit process. We ship our technology, which is assembled in Canada, to plants, which could be anywhere in the world. That technology is really a plug and play type of solution, where one system plugs in at the plant level, another one into the computers which run the plant. And then that allows them to begin injecting CO2. And that reaction occurs where that CO2 reacts with the concrete to create this very, very fine nanomaterial within concrete. The great thing about this technology is the actual operators don't even know what's happening. They don't know that they're making some of the greenest concrete in the world. The only people in the company that are typically aware of this are the person that signed the contract, the person that installed the system, and the accountant. And the accountant is able to discern that they're actually making more money, and at the same time providing a greener product to the market. So really it's a win-win type of opportunity. That CO2, as I said before, is forming these little nanomaterials within concrete, which improve its strength. And as you can see, compared to a traditional control or standard concrete, that black line shows that you're actually increasing the strength. But oftentimes what concrete producers will do is decrease the amount of cement that's used in that concrete back to the original strength, but benefit from the cement cost and CO2 benefits. Every truckload of concrete is providing just about 100 kilograms of CO2 savings. We even have new technologies that are being developed, which allow us to triple that impact. So we're really excited about what's possible with CarbonCure and bringing this to the market. Here's just a collection of some of the projects that we've supported. So it's really good to appreciate that this is not a technology that can only be used on those sort of special or flagship projects, but in fact, it's used in everyday projects from heavy industry to tech campuses or warehouses, to government projects such as airports and homes and sidewalks. So really it spans the full gamut of what concrete can be used in modern society. So how do we scale this up quickly? In the US, is what we're finding is there's been a lot of policy push towards procurement and linking up climate action with procurement. And this is a particularly effective way to scale up these kinds of technologies. And there's a number of models that have been developed in the US and in some places within Canada as well, which can be used as well in Africa to scale up these technologies without imposing any economic burden. Also, carbon credits are a really important driver in this space, where the carbon markets are actually rewarding concrete producers for using green technologies. What's really exciting about this, this market is that there are no boundaries, or borders, I should say. So buyers in Seattle or New York are able to purchase these credits, which are generated from a concrete plant operating with CarbonCure in Nairobi. And that flow of funds really is a form of climate finance that can be using to help some of the developing economies be able to afford this transition and accelerate it. So I think there's a real solution opportunity for Africa to be able to support carbon markets. And then actually, that's it. That's my last slide. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them today. Gareth, I'm not sure if we have any time now, but I do have to run at the top of the hour for a board meeting. But please send me a note if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to connect with you. Thank you very much.
Certainly, Robert, thank you very much, and a massive congratulations. You've got about 4 minutes to go on the presentation, so perfect timing. In fact, I'm going to pose 2 of the questions that have come through on the chat to you. Sorry, to the WhatsApp line, and thank you to all who use the WhatsApp line. It helps me coordinate instead of having to risk doing anything wrong here on the screen in front of me. First question is on your point on public procurement. Presumably, Robert, it's got to be outcomes driven, and this is a question from one of the policymakers on the call. How does procurement take place in such a way that it doesn't impose an economic burden, given the presumption often that an additional regulation tied to procurement may mean an additional cost? That's the first question. And then the second question is a market question. Your global operations in Africa, without, of course, naming just yet those West African markets into which you're entering, what are the top 3 considerations that have led you to decide upon those initial markets? Basically, the question is for those and several ambassadors from sub-Saharan Africa, how do they ensure that they have you in the SADC markets as well? Thank you.
So I'll cover off the last one about market selection. And so the top 3 reasons are selection criteria are partners, and partners. It's really, we're looking for those right mission aligned, capable partners, which share some of our culture, share our ambition, and are able then to really execute on our common plans, and also to impact climate change. So there's all kinds of market opportunity, but really what we've found whenever we work in international markets, it always comes down to that partner connection. And so that was really the defining reason why we chose those markets, because we found the right partner first, and that partner happened to be working in those markets. They just happened to be great places to operate too. And for the first question, can you remind me what that was?
Yes, certainly. Your point on public policy procurement.
Yeah.
How do regulators, create procurement policy that doesn't impose an additional burden? You mentioned that one's able to actually impose regulations without that economic cost, so to speak.
I think the key thing here is really challenging that presumption that clean technologies cost more. That's not the case. Like, look at the case of if like solar or other renewable energy forms, and really this is another type of technology where oftentimes, and there's many others in the concrete space, it's such a large emitting industry, is there's so many low-hanging fruit like CarbonCure which can be applied. The trick is just sending a signal to the market. The concrete producers know how to decarbonize, but they're either being held back by unnecessary regulations or no one's asking them. And they continue to do what they've always done because they don't feel, or they're not being rewarded for that procurement signal for green solutions. So that's really key. I can send plenty of different models, and there's lots of examples of how CarbonCure concrete is provided at price parity, while at the same time getting a better product with a lower carbon footprint.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Philip Morkel, I note your question. I note other questions too. Victoria, we will certainly come back to those in the Q&A and to everyone on the chat via WhatsApp. Our next speaker is somebody who has spent over 2 decades in this crucial area. And I think with so many having seen this matter of net zero rise to the fore relatively recently, 2 decades ago, Diana Cartwright has been working with Canadian companies towards these environmental objectives through good business practice. Diana, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Your first time addressing the chamber, but certainly I've had the great privilege of speaking with you before and hearing your name on several occasions, and in fact meeting you at a chamber event in person while I was visiting Canada many, many years ago. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the fore. I know you've got a presentation today that you'll be sharing, and what is so incredible is that what Robert has outlined today is not just one Canadian company, but there are so many firms punching above their weight, disproportionately contributing to the global solution for a major challenge. And I think your work deserves, first of all, massive commendations, particularly from the Canadian companies who've worked with you. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the experience you bring. And I would invite you to take the floor and share screen for your presentation. Diana Cartwright, Trade Commissioner.
Thanks, Gareth. I must say, you might have seen the picture on my screenshot. I have a real soft spot. I love Africa. I love the spirit there. So it's a pleasure to speak to people in Africa and those who also love and care about Africa. I feel like I have one of the coolest jobs ever. I get to meet companies and people like Robert and companies like CarbonCure and learn about all these technologies that are out there making a difference. So I'm with the Trade Commissioner Service, which I suspect most of you know about, but our job is to help Canadian companies export around the world, and there are 160 offices around the world. I'm in the Ontario office, where I cover clean tech, but particularly smart grid and renewable energy, and companies that are providing solutions for climate change. So I feel very lucky because I get to meet all these great companies, and that can give me hope that there are solutions and answers out there, because as you all know, and as Susan alluded to, it's really challenging what we're facing. So anywhere where we can find hope is a great thing. So and I'll just say right here too, that we have, as you'll see, we have a number of embassies and trade commissioners across Africa. So please always feel free to reach out to them if you're looking for Canadian partners, if you're looking for Canadian companies, etc. Then that's our job. We love doing it. We love helping companies. We love helping companies grow, and we're there for both Canadian companies and to help find partners in Africa. So the title of this was about net zero. So I thought I'd give a tiny context as to why we need to go to net zero. And Susan alluded to much of this too. There's been flooding all over the world. Canada's experienced really bad flooding recently, as I know have many African countries. Countries are losing their land due to flooding and climate change from rising ocean levels. Drought, there's too much water some places and then not enough water other places. I was reading that Madagascar, they're considering it the first climate change famine that happened there from drought. It's probably not the first, but and then in Canada, we're experiencing wildfires. There's going to be many more refugees. There's more conflict due to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. It's really quite scary. And I would say that the international science community is saying, red alert, stop. We have to completely change how we're doing things because we're very close to a tipping point. And I think, as Naomi Klein would say, climate change changes everything. We really have to change a lot of things. So net zero is defined as a target of completely negating the amount of greenhouse gases produced by human activity. And it's achieved by reducing emissions, and just a second, I've got something in the way here, and implementing methods of absorbing carbon. So it requires this huge transition in every aspect. And I will simply focus on the technological because each topic is a huge dissertation in itself, and I will just give a touch of some of the great companies that I see. But there's also, I believe, and this is not the government of Canada speaking, but I think there are needs for transitions in all sorts of areas, in the way we organize society, in our economic systems, how we political systems, stronger governance in some areas, in some ways, and even a spiritual transformation in our hearts. So we recognize the oneness of humanity and we begin to really work together closely. And obviously underlying addressing climate change, the issue of justice is really important, as the global north, with very little of the population, also produces a lot of the greenhouse gases. So I'm sure many of you are aware of that challenge too. So we need to mobilize quickly and make this huge transition. Robert and I both had the same chart on net zero. As you'll see, most of the technologies, there are a lot of mitigation technologies, putting in renewable energy, etc., that will help get us there. And we need to do it very quickly, as you can see in this chart, to get there by 2050. But there's also the need for other technologies that will absorb carbon, such as CarbonCures. So where does most of the greenhouse gases come? Well, this chart shows that most of it is from energy use that's used in buildings, transportation, and in industry. And that comes, so what we need to do is then, and this is where the fossil fuels are used in all these sectors, we have to change all this energy use into electrification. So basically we have to electrify our entire economy in industry, in transportation, in our homes, in our housing, buildings, everywhere has to go electric. And yet 80% of this, the energy use is used with fossil fuels. So that's a huge transition in 30 years. So we need obviously a lot more renewables. We just got to be building them everywhere and all the time. And even in Canada, where we have currently 80% of our grid is about the energy comes from clean sources, but we have to double the amount on our grid, and so we need to create 10 times as much renewable energy in our system just in 30 years. In Africa, fortunately, only 2% of the emissions come from Africa, but we also have millions of people who don't have access to electricity at all, and that's obviously a clear justice issue, and we need to change that and address that. And then there's also again, back to the issue of justice, the amount of electricity and energy used per person is hugely different between Africa and Canada. So this is where what we call the smart grid comes in, and where a huge energy transition has to occur. So traditionally, what we've always had is we've had large power plants such as coal or nuclear, gas, etc., and they create all this electricity, they transmit them to our homes and factories and buildings, and it's a very one way. What we're moving to now, and what is really complicated for utilities, is we're moving to what we call a smart grid system, or lots of microgrids, where we have energy coming in from, Joe and Bob's solar plant. We have, maybe Gareth has some, solar panels on his roof, and maybe Susan has an electric vehicle she can plug into her house. We're going to have energy storage, we're going to have windmills, we're going to have all these different sources of energy feeding into the grid. So it's going to get a lot more complicated to manage, and it already is. So we need a lot of technologies to monitor what is needed and when it's going to be needed. So you might have, the sun shining really bright right now, and then this afternoon all of a sudden there's a thunderstorm, and then the wind starts blowing, and then it stops. And so you've got to manage all these inputs and outputs of energy and balance it on the grid. And so a lot of software is needed for that, a lot of monitoring and technology. Oh, I was going to say, to go back to the renewable energy, actually we'll go forward here. The good news is that solar energy costs have declined about 90% since 2009. So in just 10 years, they've gone down by 90%. And wind costs have also declined by 72%. So this makes it a lot easier to get to our goal of net zero. And the other good news is in 2020, of all the new electricity generating capacity, 82% of that came from renewable energy sources. Now it should be 100%, but 82 is getting there. So that's the good news. We also have, so these are some of the companies that I know are working in Africa, producing renewable energy. JC Power, many of you may have heard of. They've got a large solar park in Malawi. They've got actually two that has already started producing electricity. It's one of the largest. It is the largest in that country. And they've also introduced battery energy storage into their system. AEDC has developed and financed a project, the Malindi Solar Project in Kenya. Windiga has projects in a number of countries in the pipeline, solar and grid and waste to energy, and some biomass projects, a wide variety, as well as Watt Renewables, which also does connected microgrids into the grid system and has developed solar power. Cosmic Clean Energy is in South Africa. Yeah. Oh, and Watt Renewables is in Nigeria. So these are just a few of our Canadian companies that are doing work in Africa. We also have a few companies that are doing some really interesting stuff on the affordable energy side. And one of them, Solar Panda, is based in Toronto, but they actually have most of their employees in Kenya, where they do a lot of work, where they have home solar systems that they sell to people who don't have access to the grid or electricity. People put up a small deposit up front, and they get a solar panel, and then they can connect it to cell phones, laptops, and upgrade it to charge a TV, etc. And they pay a small amount per month. It's sort of a pay-as-you-go model, so it makes it affordable. Jazza Energy is another company that does that. They provide charged, they have these solar energy hubs, and they offer rental packs with batteries, again, to charge, take them home and charge your laptop and provide some electricity. And Ready is a new company there, and Jazza is based in Tanzania, I should say. That's where they've been doing most of their work. They're looking elsewhere. And Ready is doing work in Nigeria. And it's a startup. He was just a runner-up in the Earthshot Prize. And they provide solar-powered lithium batteries that people, again, can rent. They might go to their local variety store and pick up the capsule, which can deliver energy in both AC and DC, and again, power laptops and cell phones, etc. We also have the ability to provide solar solutions through different number of means, because PV is becoming, PV panels and PV technology is becoming more and more common. Clear Blue Technologies is across Africa. They're doing great work in providing solar-powered remote telecom towers, and they've got thousands of sites where they're doing this, and they're able to monitor the input and output of power, the health of the receiver, the panel, etc., from a distance. And they also provide smart off-grid lighting. So the picture at the bottom, so it's it doesn't have to be connected to the grid. We also, Mitrix is an interesting example of technologies where the photovoltaic is integrated into the building products. So it can be integrated into shingles. In this case, it's integrated into the cladding that goes around the building. Now, it's fairly expensive, but over the long run, it breaks even, and it's cheaper because you're not having to pay for cladding and solar panels. It's just all integrated into the building. And Mitrix is a fairly large Canadian company that's started doing this. And we also have some Canadian manufacturers of PV panels. So back to the idea of the smart grid, and we have a lot of companies working in this area. One of them, which you also may be familiar with, is M1, which does a lot of provides microgrids and smart grids across Nigeria. Again, my notes, make sure I say the right thing. They have over 400 projects in Nigeria, where their main focus has been providing power supplies to health centers and hospitals and remote schools where there is not grid connections. But this project here is also a very large, it's 5 federal Nigerian ministry office buildings that have been connected through an advanced microgrid system. It also used sustainable construction practices to build it, and also developed a female STEM internship program in building it. But as part of smart grid, you need to have obviously smart meters, and Trilliant is a Canadian company that makes those, among others. Surveillant does some of the work at the backbone in systems and utilities, so they can analyze and monitor and restore and look at the operations that are going on and sort of optimize them. And if a tower or transmission grid goes off, they can detect immediately where that is and fix it. They can see if electricity is being siphoned off, etc. So a really useful technology. There's also, I mentioned In a smart grid, you can have electric vehicles that are going to be plugged into it. And this is going to get very complicated because they draw a lot of energy. So there's a lot of development of technologies and software systems that will be able to, as you maybe plug 5 cars into different chargers on the same grid, it might cause real problems. But you can use software to say, okay, well, this car will get it at 5 o'clock, this car will get it at 6 o'clock, this will get it at 7. And then there's also other technologies which will allow the car batteries or the truck batteries to feed into the grid as well, or to provide backups power to your home. So if the grid goes down, instead of needing a diesel generator, maybe just having an electric vehicle will be enough to power. So these are some of the companies involved in that, in the whole charger system. And Blue Wave is one of a number of companies that also does some of that monitoring of the smart grid. So it will look at, okay, what's the weather forecast, and input that into the system. What's the demand going to be? What are all these different factors, and how do we then balance out and make sure we get as much renewable energy as possible, so we don't have to power up a coal plant to feed into the system. And Mesco is a consulting company that does a lot of work in this area as well. So an essential part of any smart grid is a way to store the energy, because, you know, one afternoon you might have the sun shining brightly and lots of wind and all sorts of energy being created, but it's just going to get wasted if you can't store it. So there's a lot of work being done around the world to try and find newer and cheaper and better forms of storage. The lithium batteries are the sort of traditional way, and Tro's is a company that has a really good system for that. And they can be connected to EV chargers and integrated in the back of buildings and so on. But there's a company, eZinc, that's looking at developing new batteries with zinc instead of lithium, because it's cheaper and more stable and easier to access. Another company is called Hydrostore. And what they're doing is they're taking air and compressing it, putting it into a cavern or an old mine, and then compressing it. So let's say you have lots of energy. In Canada, we have lots of energy produced in the evening, and at nighttime, almost too much. We have to sell it for very cheap. So if we can store it in one of these caverns, then in the daytime, we release that energy to power, to add to our grid and to power things. These are really big, expensive, long-term things, but they're cheap over the long term. And finally, there's something called pumped storage, pumped storage, which is basically you've got a dam happening. Well, you can still keep running the water. In the evening, you're producing this electricity, but you're not using it. So you pump it, use the electricity to pump the water back up to a lake or a basin, and then use it when you need it. So this is a picture of the sort of Adam Beck plant, which is actually right near Niagara Falls. So it uses that energy in Niagara Falls and the power that's produced there, but then pumps up and stores 100 megawatts of energy storage. And it's run by Hatch is the engineer running it, the engineering company running it right now. So there's a number of solutions being looked at for energy storage. And we talked about the need to mitigate. Energy efficiency is obviously the easiest way to begin to mitigate all that energy, so we don't use as much. And Econolair is a company that's done all sorts of projects around Africa in all sorts of areas, everything from strategic advice to studies to practical programs, how to implement energy efficiency, because that's where we'll say the low-hanging fruit is, so how we can save energy very easily and quickly. We all know about CarbonCure now, which is doing some great stuff. Power HV is making transmission lines much more energy efficient, and they're doing work in Africa. And then there's the Quester eliminates the waste pollution from industrial production. So we know methane produces greenhouse gases at 21 times the rate of carbon. So if you can capture those and not have those go into the atmosphere, that will also greatly reduce the impact on greenhouse gases. And so they can make the systems much more energy efficient. And then we also have a lot of knowledge in carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and utilization. And we have a knowledge center that will be able to, connect with all sorts of companies that are doing great work in this area. Finally, we also have a lot of strong Canadian engineering companies that are doing work in Africa that can help design these systems and advise on what system will work best where, what technologies should be used, etc. And CPCS also does a lot of work on infrastructure and planning and designing of that. So there's all sorts of expertise here on how to create the most effective and energy efficient system. So just in conclusion, we do have a lot of technologies to help get Canada and help get the rest of the world and Africa to net zero. I haven't talked about all of them. I haven't talked about hydrogen and fuel cells, which we're also very strong in, or some of the water technologies, etc. But as again, please go back to your trade commissioner or myself, and we can try and connect you with what you're looking for. So, but as I'll also say, I don't think the technologies are all there. What we really need is the will to bring them into being as quick as possible. So this is a quote from Naomi Klein. Again, not government approved, but climate change isn't an issue to add to the list of things to worry about. Next to healthcare, we could say COVID, and taxes, it's a civilizational wake-up call, a powerful message spoken in the language of fires, floods, droughts, and extinctions, telling us that we need an entirely new economic model and a new way of sharing this planet, telling us we need to evolve. So I do think technology is part of that, and becoming one and getting to know each other and working together as quickly as possible also is part of it. So thank you. I'm happy to try and answer any questions, and again, feel free to reach out.
Diana Cartwright, thank you so much for such an in-depth presentation. And I must say, I did miss one crucial aspect of your biography, and that is that you were born in Sierra Leone. So like MP Barani, born on the continent, along with, I think, everyone on the call, with the exception of Robert, but he did insinuate that his company was effectively born out of their engagements of Africa and a huge impetus that came about. So brilliant. Thank you so much for those remarks. We did try and look if we had an opportunity to give a kind of regulatory look at the prospects for regulatory changes in Africa. Next week, we're going to tackle that with Pumlani Umajosi, among others, when we deal with issues particularly around water conservation. So everyone who is on this call who's very interested in the regulatory aspects, you will get a link as well as part of the follow-up along with the recording, so you can access that session next week. Dana, I'd like to kick off with two questions that have come up. And I know a number of you have also had questions that have been answered directly, so I won't repeat those. You've been engaging with the speakers, which is absolutely brilliant. Diana, when it comes to Canadian companies and their capabilities, what do you typically advise are the basic prerequisites before moving into the African market? And typically, it's the second aspect to the question, are partnerships with local companies the most effective means to actually gain market access and to start to deliver some of these solutions? You mentioned companies, for example, in South Africa with their particular procurement rules, and each market has their own specifications. So I'll actually leave that two-pronged question and then come back to the rest. Thanks.
Well, I've found the companies that I see having the most success in Africa tend to be people who are from there. So Nigerian Canadians, there's Canadians who are born in South Africa, so they really know and feel comfortable with the market, because it takes some courage to go to that market, if you don't know them. So if you aren't from country yourself, then clearly a partner is essential, and a strong partner, and that's where our trade commissioners on the ground can help advise on the best partners to find, to consider, because there might be good partners, there might be bad partners. So, but our trade commissioners often do due diligence and can help find some. So if you are a company in Africa that's also looking for a partner in Canada, it's good to approach and talk to our trade commissioners on the ground so they know about you, especially if you have an opportunity and ideas of what you'd like to do.
Brilliant. Next question goes around the issue of regulation keeping a pace with innovations. In your experience, is there a genuine challenge facing Canadian companies, presumably many companies around the world, in that their solution just simply isn't yet enabled within the framework or the presumptions of business as usual? Is that something that is often the case? Or do you think business technologies generally are coming to the fore and entrepreneurs are keeping in mind that certain regulations are the way they are and they need to adapt to those? It's a question on that tension between regulation keeping pace with the sorts of innovations we're seeing coming out of Canada. If you have any thoughts either in Canada or on the continent, that would be great. Many of our companies are actually proactively keen to engage their MPs and others to say, look, there's certain things here where we suggest we could see some even deeper change to what many have called business as usual. Yeah,
no, I agree. That's, you know, and I think the bureaucrats who do regulations are always trying to keep up with what's needed, but there's also different forces within our society too, right? Like for a lot of clean tech companies, a carbon price and the high price of oil and gas is really going to help renewables and help a lot of our clean tech companies. But there's other companies that aren't so pleased with that, or other, you know, stakeholders that are lobbying against that. So it's but yes, the regulatory environment is really key to moving things ahead, and that's where the clean tech sector, the more it can lobby and be as loud a voice as, you know, maybe the less proactive, or the ones who are happy with business as usual, it becomes important.
And thanks very much. In terms of larger Canadian companies operating across various sectors, and we know natural resources are an incredible aspect of that, where do you see, or are you seeing opportunities where Canadian companies are going in and partnering with much larger listed firms? And as part of the Trade Commissioner service, the question is that a function as well, that you're not just connecting Canadian companies to African counterparts, but to much bigger Canadian players as part of a package or Team Canada approach to investment on the continent?
Yes, thanks for that, Gareth. Yes, I think we do try to do that, and we also try to connect them to other larger companies that are doing work in Africa. So maybe not just Canadian companies doing work there, but, you know, the Turkish have a lot of engineering companies that are doing work in Africa, and we can help connect them to those Turkish engineering companies. Or I know some of the large companies in the United States, they often get projects, but then they subcontract to companies in Quebec because they need francophones for many projects. So I think a number of Quebec companies have benefited from that. So yes, I think, because as you know, we have a lot of very small Canadian companies that need to go in with larger companies. So that is a strong approach.
Yeah. And there's a question, a lot of comments on the diaspora. I see two of them on the chat. You know, it's sometimes a missed opportunity, but when it's taken up, it's a very powerful force. Susan noting that, Chris McLean, Stone Share Capital, very active in energy, making the same point. Dana, there's a question from Ottawa around, there was a program, I believe, in the nation's capital, and I'm trying to get clarity on which one, but effectively there have been cases where Canadian companies and technologies through public-private partnerships have really transformed municipalities and not just federal governments in getting to net zero. Are there any particular case studies, or one or two that you would allude to from Canada, which could be interesting, and we could go into more depth on what lessons may exist for applying it elsewhere? Yeah.
I'll have to get back to you on that. And
sure.
Perhaps there's someone in the audience who can answer that.
Yeah, I will try to get clarity on that one. Yeah, but we'll certainly chase up on that. I'd like at this juncture to note that all of you had questions. It's just hit 11 o'clock. All of you had questions for Robert. I believe those were answered. He's gone into a board meeting now, holding thumbs to approve all those projects on the African continent. But Diana will be with us for a little longer. And of course, we do have Susan here as well, and a number of other board members on the call and members of Global Affairs. So do keep those questions coming in. But next week's event is going to focus specifically on the aspect of wastewater and that environmental objective and what Canadian firms are doing. So we will be tackling in that context a lot of the regulatory issues that typically come up, specifically around procurement. Diana, to what extent, and this is a procurement question, but it relates to the African continent, to what extent do the companies you see go in because procurement is one of the top 3 factors before they enter? So they're looking for a deal or an opportunity with government versus just an opportunity with the private sector. I think my understanding is the majority of Canadian companies don't go in only on the basis of procurement opportunities with government, but you may have much better data than the rest of us on this, or better sense at least. Is it very important? Is it a top priority, typically, public procurement?
I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but
Sure.
we usually recommend the companies, if they're going into a risky market at first, that getting a contract through the IFI, such as the African Development Bank or the World Bank, etc., is a safer way to, and that involves bidding on an RFP and procurement rules. Obviously, it also takes a lot of commitment and a lot of work to get good at that, and we can help advise on that. We have trade commissioners who specifically help on IFI work. I'm not sure I understood.
Yeah. No, that's great. The question was just how big a deal it is that there's public procurement opportunities in place. Yeah, and it seems that
I was going to say, the other thing I'm hearing is a lot of companies are now selling renewable energy projects where the PPA, the purchase agreement, is with a private sector company like a Coca-Cola or a mining company or a private sector company. And if it's a sort of large company or a Western company that they know there's connections elsewhere in the world, they feel it's much safer to try and do business there than simply with a small company or an organization they don't know. So if you can be selling your renewable energy project to De Beers or to, as I say, Coca-Cola, then that's a route that's happening more and more, and a lot of renewable energy projects are being developed for the sake of buyers from private corporations now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and not mix more than one question at a time for the sake of efficiency. It's sometimes less efficient, but brilliant. A lot of thumbs up. Thank you so much for that one, Diana. Some other questions. David Schiffer, welcome. Your question is, and it's a question I think I'll pose to anyone in the room, is there data on the size of Africa's clean sector project investment size by year, by country? And a second question, is the Canadian government and the private sector working with African chambers of commerce to gauge public sector interest in the clean sector? And I won't direct this at anyone specific, but Diana, I welcome comments, and anyone else who wishes to raise their hand. David, in terms of the size of Africa's clean sector projects by year, by country, the best data I've seen is largely come from McKinsey and Company, and we're very fortunate to work with them here at the Chamber. But I'm sure there are various other sources as well, many of which probably constitute the data that McKinsey has overall. And then your question on the Canadian government and private sector working with African chambers of commerce. As a chamber of business, the answer is yes. So we've got MOUs with various chambers across the continent. And oftentimes the government of Canada has laid the foundations of those MOUs by discussing at a government-to-government level broad areas of cooperation, and that policy leadership or direction then filters down and is downstream to chambers of business, who typically then see where there are opportunities and take advantage of things like support for trade missions, incentives for specific companies, underwriting in certain sectors, and sometimes in all sectors, the value of a project. So yes, a number. I can just speak for the Chamber in regard to that second question. We've got MOUs been covering Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, exploring others. So just a few. And in some cases, even the minister has been a signatory there. So I think we are seeing quite a lot of leaning toward the private sector, passing the ball, to use that analogy, and asking chambers of commerce then to drive that and bring to the fore these sorts of business solutions that Diana has highlighted, with many companies doing some fantastic things. Diana, feel free to weigh in on any of those. I know your head was nodding. Philip Morkel, you gave quite extensive commentary. I'll leave it for anyone who wants to go to the question and answer session, but you tackled some of the issues around the work that you're doing, things like gas costs and what role CarbonCure could play, and particularly lowering of costs overall. I know business decisions do come down to the ability to actually, make financial sense. And so a lot of important considerations there. And thanks for the detail that you've provided. Q&A, I'm going to, Diana.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and realize I didn't mention this. So we usually have a clean tech trade commissioner who covers clean tech for Africa. Unfortunately, she's left and not replaced quite yet. But we also have a trade commissioner in Ivory Coast who addresses climate finance, so helps companies access the different funds that are out there, particularly for project developers and people who have an idea and they've sort of done some of the legwork and they're looking for financing. Uloge Camara, who's in the Ivory Coast, he has a lot of connections there with those funds. So we have that. He's a great resource to have, and happy to connect you to him. We also have upcoming is the Africa Energy Forum, where there's usually always a good, strong delegation of Canadian companies who are interested in doing projects and who are looking for financing and meeting with people. So I'm sure, Gareth, you're involved with the African Energy Forum. And
yeah, it certainly is a wonderful opportunity, and we are exploring our involvement there. I think our board just yesterday was discussing how big an event it is and what a missed opportunity it would be to not take full advantage there. The question that's come through, and I believe that's one of the ambassadors. The point around Naomi Klein is that when she speaks, you alluded to the point on this division, certain countries disproportionately contributing more to emissions, and certainly on the continent, a very low overall contribution to global emissions. Are there any specific areas where you think African countries can be proactively taking measures that are going to best facilitate the sort of solutions coming out of Canada? So typically, just on the most practical level, when Canadian companies look for a particular market, what are some of the key prerequisites that you think can be focused on by policymakers on the continent to attract? And question there could be anything. So subsidies, pure regulations, any viewpoint or insight you have based on feedback from your companies.
Yeah, I think what we hear most is just the issue of financial risk. I mean, companies, there's all sorts of opportunities, but if you're not sure you're going to end up getting paid, you're not going to go. So, and I know, unfortunately, EDC also tends, they take a real risk perspective, and there's not a lot of countries they'll be willing to jump into. And that's where climate finance has been developed to try and help address this risk and the importance of the IFIs and, African Development Bank to try and address this. But that is, that's always the one we hear from companies.
Yeah, brilliant. And a comment on political risk, and these are for larger projects. So Deepak Dave, with the Africa Trade Insurance Agency, there is a lot of products available on the continent as well to help now in addressing that area of risk. And very often there's a tension between the entrepreneur and the board, where the entrepreneur is willing to go in, with the board saying, look, for assurance, we need X, Y, and Z. And so I think the point is increasingly there are a wider suite of options available to address risk, real or perceived, however one may individually adjudicate that. We've got just a couple of minutes to go before wrapping up this particular session. I just want to remind everyone with us today that the recording will be available on the website in approximately probably an hour to 2 hours. So feel free to come back, and then all 11,000 members of the Chamber database will be receiving the video and the proceedings to follow up. It clearly is the case that here in Ontario, and certainly has been the case in many parts of the continent, people are back at work and back in office, but it doesn't mean for those of you watching the recording that you don't have that opportunity to engage. So please, if you're watching the recording, take a look just below your screen or below this video, and you'll see contact details to continue pursuing the discussions and the conversation. Diana, if I may, I'd like to invite you to lead us in a sense with some closing remarks or closing comments based on what you've heard today, and maybe any words for African companies who are on the call, who would like to partner with some of the solutions they see coming out of Canada, practically, what would you advise them? Can they contact trade commissioners directly too? Certainly many of them contact the chamber. Just a kind of practical conclusion to take us away to end this session.
Sure, I think exactly what you said, Gareth. If you're looking for a Canadian partner, I can't guarantee they're going to come to Africa, but I hope they would. But yes, contact Gareth, and I'm sure you'll, or the trade commissioner in the country closest to you, and we'll be happy to look at that and help. And my job is to find then a trade commissioner in South Africa may say, hey, this company is looking for XYZ, and then I go out and I look, see, do we have XYZ, and are they willing and interested to speak to that? So we're really like a matchmaking. So yes, we'd love to hear from you. There is, I hope there will be lots of opportunities and continued growth in this area.
Diana, thank you so much. And there are many requests for a copy of your presentation. Will there be some iteration we can share with those today? Fantastic. Thank you so much for leading us through and for taking the extra 15 minutes as well for pure one-on-one question time. Absolutely exemplary. And thank you for the help that you've given so many Canadian companies, many of whom we've been privileged to work with as a chamber. Very often the Trade Commissioner Service is what one of our board members called that secret sauce. That's something people don't often see, but it makes all the difference for doing business on the continent. And it means the world in terms of real tangible partnerships and some of the great success stories we're seeing, including those profiled by Minister Ng during our 4-country virtual trade mission just a couple of weeks ago. For 20 years, you've been working behind the scenes and at the forefront to take us to where we are today. So on behalf of our board, our members, we commend you and we thank you for your service. And we also thank Global Affairs at large for supporting this event through the partnership that we have for this series of webinars that we've held for this first quarter. I'm looking forward to much more together in person, and that includes seeing each of you who've been joining us. I know I'll see a number of you in Ottawa next week, and I'm very excited to be back on the continent the week after, down starting in South Africa. So thank you so much to each of you for being with us. Please do be sure to join us once again next week, Wednesday, 10 o'clock here in Ottawa and Toronto and across the continent. We have a time change, so we'll send the reminder to everyone with those details. Thank you for being with us. Have a wonderful afternoon if you're on the continent, and a great rest of the morning to everyone in Canada, and a great rest of the day as well. Bye-bye.